Hey everyone, my name is Randa Fletcher. I'm the chairperson for the Corona Norco Unified School District Special Education, CAC. Tonight we have two presenters, and we have Richard Isaacs and Valerie Aprikamian. Richard is a special education attorney and the founder of California Special Needs Law Group. He's been practicing special education for over 13 years, and he started advocating in law school back in 2007. His mission for his firm is to have parents be informed on the law and how to use the law to protect the educational rights of their child. For Valerie is an advocate, and she has been advocating for over 23 years since her daughter was diagnosed with autism. She is the founder of Advocates for Angels back in 2007. She served on the CAC many moons ago for our district as a secretary. And part of her services includes training programs to empower parents to successfully take an equal seat at the IEP table. So we want to go ahead and welcome both Richard and Valerie, and we look forward to hearing your presentation tonight. And at the end, I'll probably give you guys like a 10-minute warning. That way we can wrap it up and then open it up to some Q&As.
Thank you, Randa. And then Casey, are you going to share the presentation to start, or how do you want to do that? I can't hear you.
That's story of my life. I'm on mute. Are you able to share screen, or does it not give you that ability?
Where would I see that?
At the bottom, there should be a green box with an arrow that says share screen at the bottom of the Zoom link.
Valerie is muted too. If you can unmute Valerie, Casey.
It just says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Oh goodness, I will do it then. Let me get that going now.
Yeah, no stress.
Okay, that should work now.
And you'll have control of it, Casey, so I'll just ask you the next slide. Is that correct?
Perfect. That's perfect.
Okay. And Valerie, are you going to go on video?
She moved over because she says she can't. She's muted.
She's unmuted now, but we just can't see her video.
Can't hear. I'll wait, Valerie, until you're set up. I can talk a little bit while we wait. Casey, is Valerie working on her end on that?
That's what it looks like, yeah.
Well, let me I'll just do my introduction a little bit too. And Randa, thank you for inviting us, and thank you for the CAC for inviting Valerie and I to speak. It's always interesting when we speak at these type of events and I really appreciate the families that come, that listen. Everybody's in a different space, meaning some people are really, far along in the IEP process. Others are just starting. There's some beginning questions. There's advanced questions. So I know the last CAC presentation, Dr. Chris Davison presented. She's wonderful. Obviously, if you guys heard that, you know that. I mean, she started as I think a teacher. She was a school psych. She was a director of special education. She moved up to assistant superintendent at Long Beach Unified. She went into private practice. Like, she understands education. So hopefully that was really informative. What we would like to do is, what do you do with those assessments after this? You have the assessment report. Dr. Davison reviewed, her feedback of how she comes up and the different types of assessments. Now what? And that's really where we want to pick up. There might be a little bit of crossover from where she left off or things she touched on. But coming from us, we're looking at it from the advocacy side, the legal side. Valerie's a wonderful advocate, and just how to take that information and work with the school district to further, you know, the IEP process. Valerie, are you there yet? Not yet.
We might want to remove her and have her rejoin.
Okay, I saw that she just put that on the chat, that she's going to log out and rejoin.
Okay.
No stress, Valerie. I could talk forever, so I could just keep talking about this stuff. But as Valerie does that, so we're going to really look at the assessment reports. I know people are going to have questions. Feel free to ask any question. I assume Valerie would agree with this. We're more than happy if we can't get to questions to address them after the fact as well. Our goal is for families to walk away from, you know, tonight's presentation and be able to have useful data that they could actually put in practice, to understand things a little bit better so they can work with the IEP team. And so, you know, we really want this to be meaningful to everybody.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. We fixed it. I don't know what was wrong, but it works now.
Great. And I see your video too.
Yes. We're good to go. Good evening, everyone.
So I was just sharing while you were off, Valerie, that, you know, our hope is to pick up where Chris left off, to talk our perspective of lawyers and advocates on how to take this information, these assessments, and how to work with the IEP team. And when we're hopeful that this information is going to give, you know, some of the families really useful and beneficial tools that they can go into with their next IEP meeting and use.
Yes, absolutely. That's our focus tonight. And with me being an advocate and an expert in the IEP process and knowing the parent perspective and also being a parent, all kind of come from that perspective. And then Rich will come from an attorney, more legal perspective. So I think it's going to be a great team.
Great. So we have about 19 slides to get through. They're pretty general. We'll go into detail. We're not polished on this presentation yet. You're presenting with somebody, so we might repeat some information and go, just be flexible. Casey, one question before we start. With the questions coming in, how are we going to field them? Or are we going to just leave time at the end and walk through them?
Exactly. So what we're asking anyone who has questions to please use the Q&A feature on Zoom, and then we will get to those at the end of the presentation instead of interrupting during the presentation. And as Randa shared, please ask as many questions as you'd like, and we will get through as much as we can at the end of the presentation.
Great. So we're going to talk about assessment reports, what they are, why they matter, and what to do with them. Casey, you can go to the next slide. Really quick background information. You know, this is really just kind of where we're going with this, but something that even as attorneys, you know, we try to remind everybody of the purpose of the IDEA. It hasn't always been around. Education and special education specifically continues to evolve, but it's really important sometimes to go back to what's the purpose of all of this. And that's just to read this. This is the first part of the IDEA, which is the law that provides for IEPs and all this stuff, is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. And that's really the key here, is to prepare our students, you know, your children, for further education, employment, and independent living. And sometimes it's good to step back and just remind the whole IEP team what the purpose is. Everything in the IEP, all goals, all services, and all placements must have this purpose in mind. It's easy to skip over. It's easy to get caught in the weeds. So that's why we put that here. Valerie, do you have anything to add on that slide?
Yeah, I think this is really good for parents to just remember. It's hard to think about this when your child is small, but that is the big picture, and that we always want to have that as the end goal. That is my child going to leave high school with the skills they need to go on to continued education or some kind of a training program, and or to get a gainful employment and live independently after high school. And that is the purpose of IDEA, as Rich said.
Great. And then district assessments versus the independent assessments. Chris or Dr. Davison might have gone into this a little bit. Since we're talking about assessments, there's multiple ways to bring assessments to the IEP team. For the district, for the most part, you're looking at initial assessments. That's when they first qualify or assess to determine qualification or eligibility for an IEP. Every 3 years, if they have to reassess at least every 3 years, unless it's agreed upon to do it sooner. And those are our triennial assessments. The outside or the independent assessments, and that would be like Dr. Davison, what she would be, those are provided as IEEs, which is your independent educational evaluations, or sometimes just private evaluations. The IEEs, that terminology is because the district's going to fund those. And then we have private assessments as well. The IEP team looks at them a little bit differently, and we'll talk about that as we move forward. Any thoughts there, Valerie?
Nope, we're good.
Okay. So why assessments matter? All placement decisions are made by a group of persons, including the parents and other persons, knowledgeable about the child, the meaning of the evaluation data, and the placement options available. Just for reference, that's that 34 CFR, that's the Code of Federal Regulations. That's, if you Google it, that's where you can find the site. But just breaking this down, you know, the placement decisions are made by a group of people. That's the IEP team. That's the parents. That's you. And that sometimes that can get dismissed, or you don't feel part of the team. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. And other persons, and the key word here is knowledgeable about your child. It's people who can bring value to the IEP team. That's in the meaning of the evaluation data. That's the assessors. Those are the related surface personnel that are working with your child. It's really important to understand the makeup of the team that makes these decisions.
Yeah, and I would add that why assessments matter is that assessment is the foundation for the IEP and development of the IEP. And many times parents don't realize or understand that. And they don't understand, you know, I don't think that my goals are right, or why can't I make my IEP team understand that I think my child needs more services in one area or another. And it's based off of the assessments and the assessment data, which are the facts. So assessments are hugely important in the development of your child's IEP.
Absolutely. So the assessments are done. Now what? And we're kind of picking up where the last presentation left off. It's time to prepare for the IEP meeting. Simple, seems obvious, not always the case. Make sure you have a copy of all assessment reports prior to the IEP meeting. Valerie, you could probably weigh in here.
Yes.
How often does that happen where you get a copy of the report in advance?
Well, I always make sure to ask for when. Usually what I always tell parents, and what I do is I request the copy of the assessment report right when we sign the assessment plan. And so I, give the assessor, the upfront, request. We would like to have a copy of the assessment report prior to the meeting, because parents need to be knowledgeable and be familiar with the information, because it's very difficult for parents to sit in a meeting if they've never seen these findings and be presented the report and have it come at them without being familiar with it. It's almost impossible to interpret all of that information, understand the test scores when you haven't seen it prior. So when you get it prior, you can read it over, you can highlight what you don't understand. You can even call the district assessor or your IE provider and ask them questions prior so that you can be an equal IEP team participant at the meeting, understanding what is there and being able to take part in the IEP team conversation. So it's extremely important to get that assessment report prior to the meeting.
I agree. And there's nothing in the law that requires the district to provide it in advance.
Yes.
It obviously makes the most sense to, whenever families, get IEEs and they share them with the district, they want them in advance. And it's understandable. They want to be prepared. Yes. Some of the things that you can do, like Valerie said too, is, definitely request a copy. There is a 60-day timeline for the district once you sign the assessment plan for them to complete it and hold an IEP meeting. Understandable that they're rushing sometimes the last minute. The report might be the date of, they're making edits the morning of the meeting. You can always postpone the IEP unless there's an urgency. But if you don't have a copy of the IEP meeting, we don't want to waste people's time. We definitely don't want to waste the district's time by going to an IEP meeting that you haven't prepared for. So you can always postpone it until you get a copy of the report. That's just going to lead to a better, more meaningful IEP meeting. The next piece, as you said, Valerie, and this is 2 here on the slide, you want to read all the reports. You want to highlight any areas of concern you have, something you don't understand, as you pointed out, deficit areas, and we'll talk about that. Write down any questions you have, and you can't do that at the IEP meeting when you're looking at the report and hearing the presentation of the report at the same time. So it's really important for you guys, and it is good. And the assessor should meet with you. Anybody who assesses your child and drafts the report should meet with you prior to the IEP meeting, go over the report, what they're working on, get your feedback. You're going to obviously do the interview in the beginning to hear about your concerns, but you should also have a post follow-up outside of the IEP meeting with the assessor, so you can just talk one-on-one with them. The purpose of the assessment, and this is here just at the bottom, is to find what area or which areas of deficit is impacting your child's ability to access and benefit from their education. This is it. We get these assessments to understand what the student needs. Where are they struggling? Well, this should answer it. And so you really can't, the value, you can't over describe how valuable these assessments are. If you feel that your child's not making progress, if you feel that your child's really struggling, or they're coming home, crying, they have anxiety, it's not working, and it's not working, but you don't know why, you don't know how to identify it, that's where these assessments come in.
And I want to bring up something, it might not be the best place, but I thought about it now, is that, Rich, what is your, what does the law actually say? Because I want to see if you're going to say what I think it is that the parent input, being able to take part in the assessment process, such as the assessor contacting the parent, interviewing the parent, getting the parent input on their concerns for that assessment, or even filling out questionnaires, things like that. Is the assessor is that part of the requirements of an assessment? Or can the parent be not called, not asked to fill out, and have no contact with the parent? Because that has occurred before.
Yeah, and I know we're not talking specifically about IEEs. We could do a whole presentation on that.
Yes.
But it is required. And one of the ways we get public funding of outside assessments is when they don't include the family, when they're not called, they're not interviewed, they haven't filled out their rating scales. They have, so it's the assessments, it doesn't work without the family's input.
Yes. And that's right in the law about parent participation. We're correct.
Absolutely. Really good thing to point out.
So just parents should know that, because they're part of, the IEP team, and they should always be interviewed and allowed to fill out questionnaires as well.
Absolutely. So what we did here, and we'll talk about this, is this is actually a recent assessment done on a student. It's a district assessment. It's a really good district assessment. It's not an outside assessment. It's not an IEE, but I wanted to snapshot a few pieces of this assessment to show, and we'll walk through how Valerie would approach this information. I'll show, I'll share how I would approach this information, and hopefully you can learn from that. So when you go to an IEP meeting and you're looking at this data and these charts, you have some direction on what to do with it. So right here, and Valerie, you can add in, here's the bell curve. All the assessments, the standardized assessments, these are standardized scores. They're all normed. And every few years when they come out with new assessments, they re-norm them. But it gets really confusing to understand. So here's you guys, I'm looking at my arrow that I'm using, but you can't see that. But if you look at the scores here, most students, the very top is 100. That's your mean. 50% are above, 50% are below. Okay. And average is going to fall between 80 and 110. It should be in there. So if you go 90 to 110, that's your average. Then you have 80 to 90, which is your low average on this chart. And then high average is 110 to 120. So the 90 to 110, that's where the majority of all students are going to fall who take this assessment. And they vary because they're normed differently. So if you go to the chart below, it says standard scores, and then it goes all the way down. And then on the far right, it says the label. So well above average to the very bottom, well below average. And then it has percentile rank and the scaled scores. Okay. Not to get too complicated here, but it's really important to understand where your child falls in certain areas. So we have processing, we have academic, we have all different areas that we're looking at, and we all have strengths and weaknesses. That's not uncommon. But what we're trying to understand is, are these deficit areas impacting our ability or your students' ability to access their learning at their potential? And I'll let you add a little bit there, Valerie, as well.
Yes. So I think the most important thing here is that many times when we're in an IEP and we're reviewing the assessment, the parent will be told, oh, your child's in the average range, but your child might be at an 81. But that's the low average range on the borderline of below average. So that would be a concern. And yes, that would be called the average range. However, that is low average, and that's not the norm of 90 to 110. So Rich, do you want to talk a little bit about what would be considered the deficit range where they would have to absolutely either develop a goal or do some kind of an intervention when we're told, oh, your child is still in the average range?
Yeah, so we really are looking at we don't put all of our eggs in one basket, but there is a lot of that's what I'm looking for, benefit to looking at IQ score. So what is the student's potential? And don't put a lot of weight into it, because they're different years, different setting, different tests. The score is going to vary a little bit, but the idea is, what is your child's potential? Because one of the things to remember is we don't want to measure them with everybody else. We don't want to say, oh, they're average. Average to who? Everybody else in the class, but where are they, compared to themselves, compared to their potential? So this chart here, and we'll go into some of the data, this student's IQ is actually 120. That's a nonverbal IQ that this student had, with a full scale IQ of 111. So if we look at the chart, their high average IQ, so they should potentially be performing at that level. And we'll see as we go to the scores that they're performing in some areas well below that level, which means that we need some intervention. What happens sometimes, and is if you're super low, and we have a lot of students who are really struggling, and it's not even a question, it's just we're looking at functional skills. They're down here at the below the second percentile. And so it's a whole different model. It's not focused so much on building a great academic performance at grade level. It's building life skills, functional skills. But when we have students who are just, say right in the, their average IQ, say 100, and they're performing in the low 80s, oftentimes that's not going to trigger the district to notice concerns. Say, yeah, they're within the range. You know, a lot of times students are, you know, in a general education classroom can be, you know, 2 grade levels behind, and there's a lot of classroom intervention. True, but what about your child? You know, and that's where these assessments come in. And that's where you look at, we'll talk about the goals and how to address certain areas and develop a goal from. The bigger the discrepancy, the easier it is to say, hey, we need to put some intervention in. The smaller the discrepancy from your potential to your academic or performance on anything, it gets a little bit, well, you know, are they achieving right where they should be? So it's a good discussion for IEP teams, and we'll talk about it at the next slide. Thanks, Casey. So here, this is the Woodcock-Johnson. I assume the last presenter, Chris Davison, talked about it. It lists this student. So remember, I shared that this particular student has a full scale IQ of 110 or 111 it was, and then a nonverbal of, so on the high end of 120. It's an autistic student. And so we look here, and this is just her you know, her understanding of sounds, right? Her spelling of sounds, word attack, the phoneme, what makes up sounds, the grapheme. She's got a 69. That's the second percentile. That's very low. So we have a student with high average IQ who is understanding of sounds is at the second percentile. So that's, so if, you know, when I look at this, and if I went to an IEP meeting, I'd ask the assessor, we'll explain this. What does that mean? What does the phoneme, the grapheme knowledge mean? And here's the subcategories: word attack, spelling, sounds. Explain that, and then explain what that looks like in the classroom. This is a 5th grade student. So what does that look like when the student is reading 5th grade level text? Valerie, I'll let you go too.
Yeah, so my question that comes up for me from a parent perspective would be, many times there will be 2 or 3, when there's more subtests, there will be 2 or 3 really low subtest scores, but then the overall score will come out not you know, too bad, maybe the low average range. And so it's kind of, you know, taken as, oh, it's okay, they're doing fine in that area. So, but I always see that, and this happens with vision and auditory processing a lot too, where that a lot of times, because we're not looking at specifically vision or auditory in a psychoed assessment, but it's a kind of little red flags that, hey, look, there's some problems there in those areas, and might require asking for a vision assessment or asking for an auditory processing assessment to dig deeper and actually see if there are problems there. But many times the IEP team will feel that no, because the overall score does not warrant that. What would you say about that, Rich?
Yeah, let's see on the next one if we have an example of that, because that's a really good point. Casey, can you? Yeah, thank you. We don't have well, I mean, our scores, I was kind of showing the low scores. So you have what Valerie is saying. So let's look at the broad written language. It's a 61 here, but let's say that was an 85. And let's say that we had a couple of the sub scales here, which are the you know, assessments looking at spelling of sounds, but they had an 85, but then they had like 52 spelling. They would easily miss over this. And this is, when I say they, this is the team. This is a lot of assessors. They focus on, well, you know, overall it's a 61, but sometimes we need to go deeper than that. And we need to know, like, did anything drag this score down, or did anything pull the score up? And so we just don't address it with intervention. That's what you're leaning towards, right, Valerie?
Yes, absolutely.
So all the scores matter. And I think, you know, as parents and going to an IEP meeting, and we have this, ask questions. I'd want to know, like, at 52, if you look at the standard score, average being 100, like we discussed, and 90 to 110 is that average range. And then you are spelling at a 52. Well, how is that going to impact writing? How is that going to impact your ability to read and sign? This is a 5th grade student. You know, they're not, after a 3rd grade, you're reading to learn. You know, up until then, you're learning to read. But now what? This just screams like, what is going on? And then what happens, and we'll get to this later, well, where do we go with once we identify these low areas? So it's easy to skip over this. It's easy to read this fast and go to an IEP meeting and say, okay, read this. You know, a good assessment is going to break down in these paragraphs what these assessments do, what they measure. And it does give you the ability to ask the assessor, explain more, tell me more. And then I always like to know, and when the teacher's at the IEP meeting, Valerie, I'm sure you do this too at times, tell me what the classroom looks like. I want to visualize the classroom. Tell me how many students, tell me, you know, are you broken into groups? Are there other adults in the room, depending on the setting? Paint the picture, then tell me how you work with this student. Tell me how you know, these low scores are impacting their ability. What are you seeing? And the teachers who work with the students the most, you know, they're usually pretty open. There are times where teams will tell them not to really answer many questions, which is unfortunate. We can have a presentation about how to get IEP meetings, you know, and deal with that kind of stuff. But this is the exact data that you would build goals from, and we'll get to that.
Yes, yes. So that's another reason why it's so important for parents to have that time to read it very carefully and identify low scores.
Yes. Absolutely. Thanks, Casey. You can go to the next slide. Just another example here of an assessment. This is the language piece. You can look here, you know, you look at for this student specifically, this is the CASEL, receptive vocabulary, that, you know, that's how you're understanding vocabulary coming in. It's a 75th percentile, standard score is 110. That's right along a line with his student's potential. You know, it's right there. But then you skip down and you look at expressive vocabulary and it's 65. It's the first percentile. So how do you go how does this look in the classroom for a student who has receptive vocabulary, high average, 110, right at that brink of going into the high average side, but then they're expressive, how they communicate at the first percentile. And so those are the questions you ask. And then these are the areas that we know you bring in speech and talk to speech about this, the psychologists who assess about this as well, other assessors, when they're like, oh yeah, we notice these deficits in language, specifically in the expressive vocabulary. And that's where we start having these great discussions at IEP meetings about developing a goal. So that's the data. That's what you're going to review before the IEP meeting. And now we're going to get to the IEP meeting here. So in developing the IEP meeting, this is just some of the structure really quick. The IEP team, and again, we talked about this. This is the knowledgeable people. This is you as a parent. You're a key member of any team that's going to make decisions about your child's education. But we're going to look at the strengths of the child. We're going to look at the concerns of the parents for enhancing the education of their child. And Valerie, not to keep hitting on this, but the concerns of the parents are so important.
Yes.
What happens in the home impacts what happens at school. What happens at school impacts what happens at home. You know, and one of the things is it's a quick day. The student's great at school. They've held it in. They've struggled all day, and it just comes out in behavior at home, or emotions at home, or the parents are struggling with, you know, executive functioning deficits, working on organization, homework completion, all these things, and it's just nightly, you know, frustrations. Well, that the team needs to know about that, because, you know, that a lot of that could be arising because it's an inappropriate program. The services aren't working for the student at school. And so the IEP team must consider these, the concerns of the parents. And then here, the third part, the results of the most recent evaluation. That's our assessments. They must consider that, their own assessments, and the outside assessments, and then the academic, developmental, and functional needs of the child. Everything comes into play for the IEP team to consider.
Yes. And I would add, parents, I highly recommend that you sit down and you think about, because you're going to be asked this question, parents, what are your concerns, priorities for this school year, especially when it's at an annual. But even if it's not an annual, you still have the opportunity to discuss what your concerns are for that meeting. So I would be prepared to be asked that question, and be prepared to know what are you going to say, because most of the times parents forget about that, and then they have all this stuff in their head and all this stuff they wanted to address, and if you don't have it written down and you haven't prepared, you're asked that question and then you forget what you wanted to say, or you get nervous and you just start talking, and then the scribe will just kind of pick up a few words here and a few words there of what you said, but many times it doesn't translate to what your real concerns were. So I would be very prepared to be very clear on when they ask that statement of you.
That's a really good point. Absolutely. Because, you know, as a lawyer, we usually get involved after there's a problem. Something's been broken for a while, and it eventually goes to the legal side sometimes. And we're going back and reading the story. We're going back and saying, what happened? How did we get here? And we go back to the IEPs and the concerns of the parents. There is a section in every IEP is so crucial. And, you know, to the district's credit, they can't fix something or they can't address something, you know, that unless they know about it. And so the concerns and laying it out, and it's so helpful for when we resolve cases or find solutions, is to say, oh, for the last 2 years, parents have been bringing this up as a concern. The assessment data shows this is an area of deficit. Let's address this now. Maybe there's makeup services that we need to put in place to address the lack of services that were provided. And you're right, Valerie, sometimes it's a really quick sentence. Nobody's kind of giving it a lot of thought. They're not asking a lot of questions to fish it out. And then it just gets repeated. The same thing. I'll see the same concerns for 5 years because they never really stopped and readdressed it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The strengths of the child too remains the same. Yeah.
I know. So that's a really good point. Before the IEP meeting, especially the annuals or when you're going to review stuff, jot this down. Mm-hmm. Be prepared with that information so it can be discussed.
Yeah, I have my parents actually write out their statement, and many times they'll just read it because then it's all there. They have it down. And it includes everything. And what I also recommend to parents is write out your own parent agenda, because the district has their agenda of things they are mandated to do in the IEP process at an IEP meeting. However, you can write, these are my requests, these are my concerns, and make your list, and that's your agenda. And then your case carrier can combine your concerns in the proper section of the IEP process during the meeting. And that also serves as documentation of parent concerns later down the road.
Absolutely. And I know there's some questions coming in, so we're going to get to those. We have a few more slides we'll just get to in case that addresses your questions. And then we'll get to some questions. So presenting assessment reports at the IEP meeting. So this is just, and I put this slide in here because I've seen this recently, and I think part of that is because the shortage of staff and the moving around and just how busy everybody is. But the assessor should present their own findings. And there's been a few IEP meetings the last 6 months or so where we've had the district assess, but that assessor doesn't present. And it's okay. I mean, it's definitely legal to have somebody else present. The team just has to have somebody knowledgeable about that area. But it's really helpful because so much of it is what happened with the student? What were the behaviors like? What was the engagement like during the assessment? There's just questions that we have that can't be answered by somebody else presenting. And I've seen a few IEEs recently too, not like the heavy ones or the big ones, some of like the smaller assessments, so to speak, where the district will hire an agency and it will be a different presenter, somebody else who works in the office present. So just like a little tip here, just make sure that you make the request. If you have to move the IEP meeting around or reschedule it, no problem for the most part. Try to get the assessor that actually performed the assessment at the IEP meeting. Any thoughts on that, Val? I don't know if you've seen that.
I think that's good. I don't want to run out of time.
Reviewing assessments at the IEP meeting, following, I'll make this, because I want to get to the questions here, following versus considering recommendations. What I've seen is, and I don't like this, but a lot of the district assessments, you'll read all this data and then recommendations. it'll be determined by the IEP team. And you're like, well, it feels like just like you walk, like the movie ended before the end. And you're like, wait, what happens? It's the assessor that is supposed to make the recommendation to the IEP team. The IEP team and ultimately a district admin is going to make the decision of what FAPE is. But that assessor must recommend what that student needs to get a FAPE. And it's one of the, so if it's not in the report, it's obviously what you ask the assessor at the meeting. What are you recommending? What, so if you have eligibility and you find that the student's autistic, or the student has a learning disability, or the student has this, what are you recommending in terms of services to meet those identified areas of need? And what programming specifically? The district doesn't have to follow, what they say, though I think that they should, because that's the assessor. But you as a parent have every right to understand what the recommendations would be to address those areas of need.
Right. And I agree with you, Rich. I see most district assessments don't make recommendations. That IEEs make recommendations. They write goals, they write recommendations for services and big loads of accommodations. But most district assessments will say at the end, the IEP team will make that decision. Absolutely, happens all the time.
So I know, and it is really frustrating. It's one of those things that we really try hard to work in collaboration. If it's not in the report, definitely ask pointed question to the assessor. Okay, what are you recommending? We need a recommendation from you. The IEP team needs to consider it, so you need to make recommendations. And then the other just note here is for the IEEs and those outside assessments you bring into the district, they don't have to accept the recommendations, and the argument is if it's a district assessment, they have to accept their own recommendations. That's at least the argument that we make. This is your assessment, you own it. Well, the outside assessments, they have to consider those recommendations, and meeting that bar is really, really low. If you present it, they've considered it. Okay, next, is that good there? Well, I'll try to move, Valerie.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about that though, right? How to,
yeah, when we get into the goals and the
slide. Okay, I thought so.
Okay, so the role at the meeting, we've already hit on this. Ask questions and ask questions and ask questions. Like we, even as attorneys, we ask a ton of questions. You have all the educators there. You have all the decision makers there. Ask questions. This is great. And I know it can feel a little intimidating, and I probably, doing this 13 years, we just can get in there and get it. And as a parent, sometimes they say it's all these faces looking at me and I'm on one side of the table. And I love it when a district rep sits right next to the parent, or they sit there, this is when there's no advocates and you just like, hey, the teacher comes down and sits right next. We're a team here. Yes. So ask the questions. Do you have anything there, Valerie?
No, that was good.
Okay. Do the assessments address all concerns, or have they created more questions? A lot of times we'll see from these assessments that additional assessments are necessary. You might identify, a learning disability, and then because of it, it's an auditory processing disorder. So the student's not actually bringing, the information's coming in, and it's not the hearing, but it's how they're processing that information. So we'd want to get an auditory processing assessment. There might be a vision assessment, not like vision like glasses, but the visual processing. How is the information being processed once it comes in? And we can identify a lot of areas of weakness, and there are services for those. So just because they do a psychoed, OT, and speech, you might need additional assessments.
But I very rarely see recommendations for additional assessments from a district assessor. Parents need to learn how to identify those low test scores like we talked about, and then you can request. I look at these low test scores here in vision. I would like to request a vision processing assessment, a developmental vision assessment, or look at all these low scores in auditory processing. I would like to request a CAPD, Central Auditory Processing Disorder Assessment. So you can absolutely request that, parents, when you see low scores, and then have that discussion with the IEP team. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. We have low spelling, like in the example we showed you. super low, 40-point difference or something. I think it was more than 40 points. What's going on? How are they understanding? Are they hearing the sounds? Let's get to auditory processing. Are we not processing that language that's coming in? And that triggers that. Really quick, Casey or Randa, I know it's about 6:50. I want to take some questions. How long do we have? What's our stop?
We're supposed to be done at 7.
Okay.
We can possibly go over maybe 5-10 minutes. We have 15 questions right now in the Q&A.
Yeah.
See that, or do you not see it?
Yeah, we do have several questions that we'd
Valerie, what do you think, Valerie? Would you like to hit some questions?
Yeah, I do want to get to at least finish on us giving a little bit of overview on when you're reviewing your IEE, what should parents do at that meeting?
Go to that. Okay, so developing a plan. How about this slide? So goals drive service. The more goals, the more services. The purpose of goals is to allow the IEP team to determine whether the student is making progress. This kind of goes back to the beginning, and I don't want to talk too long on this, about the purpose of the IDEA. Well, what's the purpose of goals? I think sometimes we forget that. Is the student making progress? So go ahead. I know you have a lot to add here, I think, Valerie.
Oh, sorry.
No, I think that's okay, Casey. I think you can go to the next one. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk about the goals?
Yes. So as we talked about, every deficit area, the IEP team is obligated to address the deficit area with some kind of intervention, such as a goal or an accommodation or services. So parents just know that if your child has a deficit, then the deficit needs to be addressed with intervention. And also that, a lot of times IEP teams get a little bit nervous or uncomfortable when there are a lot of goals. They don't want to have too many goals. However, if your child has a deficit area, then there needs to be a goal written in that area so you can measure that goal and make sure your child's making progress towards that goal and addressing that deficit area. So I wanted to add that.
And that's a really important piece. Even if they're not going to agree to the goal, it's really important to get into IEP notes or follow up after, like, hey, I had we wanted a goal in this specific area and relate it to the deficit, like say they don't have a spelling goal and you request it. Like, we have a standard score in spelling of a 51, and this is why we want to, because as a lawyer, we can look at it later and go, wow, that was a concern. They requested a goal. Why didn't you provide one? So even though they may not agree to everything, definitely share your concerns and make the request. But in general, there's nothing wrong with IEPs having 15 to 30 goals. Right. We work on it all the time. It's not the number of goals. It's what does the student need? There's no limit. It's what does the student need? And we have plenty that have 3 goals because that's really what their needs are.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And then sometimes, like the example, I had an IEP today where the speech path didn't want to, or maybe it was the OT, but they didn't. There was 2 goals and they were very relevant, both the goals, but she wanted to start with the first one because that was basically the baseline and the first step. And then she said, as soon as we start making some progress there, then I'll write the next goal. And we agreed. Then we said, okay, that's great, but please document in the notes, because a lot of times we forget and then they forget too. And then that second goal never gets written. So parents, you remember, as long as it's written in your IEP in the notes, you remember it and say, hey, look, my child's making progress. Let's write that next goal. And then you get the second goal. So you can work with your team, but just make sure those goals are addressed.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. Okay, that was the last slide there.
Okay, great.
So how can we do the questions?
Yeah, I would just like to read them and then we'll see if you can give a succinct response. Some of these are very great questions. So I'll start with the first one. This says, my question is of my son's assessment, show visual processing deficits, and they say they can't create goals for visual processing deficits. The school says no point in using assessment data. How do we use assessment data like processing deficits into goals?
So there was an assessment or no?
This one says, my son's assessments show visual processing deficit. They say they can't create goals for visual processing deficits. How do we use assessment data like processing deficits into goals?
Oh, so there doesn't sound like there was a vision processing assessment. Ask for a vision processing assessment, right, Rich?
Yeah, absolutely. So it looks like, so they've identified an area of weakness, which is very visual processing, probably coming out of the psychoed assessment. So that just shows that, and I put somewhere in the slides, the threshold for assessing is really low. So, and parents have every right to request additional assessments. And so if you are seeing visual processing, I would definitely get a vision therapy assessment from an ophthalmologist or optometrist, somebody who's familiar with, and I would work with the district, not just an eye doctor, but you want somebody who knows the educational setting and can look at the how not once it's coming in, how it's being impacted by the brain. And a lot of times we'll see that the eyes aren't teamed right. So, you know, going up and down or near point to far point, you're not able to copy, and it's just slowing you down, the processing slowing you down. And then when you're taking notes, you can't hear because you're focused on the notes. It all fits in. So the more information, and I don't know specifically, I haven't really thought about that without a visual processing like goal, but you're looking at what's the deficit that's caused by the vision processing deficit? And is it, you know, where are you struggling at? You definitely need more information, but you definitely can get a goal that would look at growing that skill set. Because when we get vision therapy services, we have goals that we're trying to meet. That's the service we're getting. And a lot of times you'll see with vision therapy, you're going to get, you know, 25 or more sessions to start, track progress. It's not a cure-all. It doesn't fix everything, but for some it does. It helps a lot. But you definitely would want more information.
And from the same participant, and I accidentally answered this one live incorrectly, so I'm going to reread her question for you to answer. It says, are they required to provide additional assessments based on low test scores? And how do we know what test to ask for when seeing a low score?
Yeah, do you want me to start with that, Valerie?
Well,
or do you want to
see, this is where you need a little bit of education and training on that, because there's lots of different assessments that many parents don't know about. And depending on what area of need of where the deficit is would determine what kind of assessment you would ask for. So it's kind of a big question to answer, because I'd have to list all the different assessments you could ask for, but how would you answer that, Rich?
Yeah, no, you're right. And it gets complicated. And that's why, you know, there's so much confusion about all this.
Yeah.
You want to work with the district and say, okay, well, what are we going to do? Do we need more information? Because having a deficit and ignoring it is a problem. And saying, well, we're just going to leave that. No, we identified an area of need. Now what? Okay, maybe we don't have enough information, so maybe we need more information. It's always better to have too much information than not enough. So go get additional assessments and ask whether they're required to, you know, that's it. There are certain things, but the law is pretty clear that if you request an assessment, the district better have a really good reason that it's not appropriate to defend itself. Okay, so if the data shows that further assessments are necessary, most likely if you work with the district and should that they should assess. But required, it gets a little hazy there.
Yes.
Next question. What is the timeline to disagree with an assessment in order to request an IEE?
So you have there's a 2-year statute of limitations with the IDEA. So the law is pretty settled here in California. It's actually different in different states, the statute of limitations. In California, it's 2 years. So you need to request it within two years, but the sooner the better, because you really want that additional information. Valerie?
Oh, Valerie's, she stepped away for a second, looks like.
Oh, okay.
Okay, my
dog is barking. So
oh, that's a guy. Okay, I saw you.
We still
Like, you're
have
right.
about 13 questions. I see
Okay.
more coming in. We may not get to all of them, but we will certainly send them to the CAC board to follow up with as well.
Rapid fire session. Okay.
Yeah, let's go. So this parent says, I requested a copy of the assessment reports and IEP 5 days before the meeting, but I didn't receive it before the meeting. Is there a way to hold them accountable?
No, there's nothing to hold accountable. You can postpone the IEP meeting until you get them if you want. That's your choice, and just state your reason. But work in collaboration. There's nothing in the law requires the district to give you the reports in advance.
Right.
It's just a courtesy.
Yes, but it's best practices for them to get you the assessment prior to, because just as the district needs an assessment before the meeting, because if we went into a meeting and handed our team, here's an assessment I got outside and I want you to consider it today in this meeting, they would say, I'm sorry, I can't do that because we're just looking at it now. We'll have to call another meeting for that. Well, parents, you have the same, opportunity. You need to review it prior as well. And if we're a team and you're an equal member of that team, then you should be given that courtesy to be able to prepare for your meeting and be given that assessment report prior to the meeting as well. And so I would definitely make that point with your IEP team that you can't possibly be an equal IEP team member if you don't have the opportunity to prepare and review that and interpret it prior to the meeting.
Okay, so we probably have time for a few more. I'm not sure we'll get to all of them, but the next one, is it true you have to be 0 to 7% on the bell shape to qualify for services? District said at 10%, child doesn't qualify for services.
No, that's not true. So for speech and language services, you have to be below the 7th percentile. There's exceptions to that, but you can't use that for everything else. To qualify for services, it's based on your need and your so kind of going back to those assessments. If your potential is super high and you're still average, but that gap between your potential and where you're performing is wide enough, you would get services. It has nothing to do with percentiles necessarily. That 7th percentile relates only to speech and language services.
Mm-hmm.
And I think adaptive PE as well.
Okay, and it could be, I'm not familiar with that one, but that would make sense.
Okay, next one. Does the parent need to agree to dismiss an IEP team member?
No.
I mean, if they're a mandatory member, they're going to request you to, and they have to have certain members to hold a valid IEP meeting. So I'm not sure what dismiss means.
Well, if someone is at if we're at an IEP, and then they say, oh, parents, is it okay if so-and-so leaves? They have to pick up their child or they have another meeting. The parent has the right to say, well, but that's my speech pathologist and I have speech concerns. And so, no, I don't give permission for them to leave. I wasn't given an excusal form prior to the meeting, or I was not informed that my speech pathologist would be leaving early. I was prepared for them to be here. So I don't agree for them to leave. You have that
right. If they're a mandatory member of the team, yeah, the district could either reschedule the meeting then or stop the meeting or keep that person there. But as a parent, you have every right to keep your mandatory members at that meeting.
Yes, unless you were offered an excusal form prior and you agreed prior because you were informed prior. Oh, speech, okay, I don't have any speech concerns. We don't have that on the agenda. I think it's okay to excuse my speech pathologist, and you would sign your excusal form and then they could be excused.
Okay, next question. What about high school? My son was passed year to year for 9 years, saying he will outgrow it. And now he is in 9th grade at 4th grade abilities. And they don't know how to create goals for kids who are so delayed in a setting that most kids are doing close to grade level, so they can't create an appropriate IEP. Can I ask for them to provide a specialist to craft my son's IEP?
You can request anything, right? And that's really important. And I'm really sorry to hear that. There are times where, it's developmental. That's really concerning what you shared. And it's really getting more information about what your child needs. You know, at some level, you're going to take that grade level curriculum and try to modify it down or accommodate it down. Sometimes we have to flip that the other way. And this is always hard for teams to understand at first often, but we want to actually start at your child's actual grade level performance and build up from there. And so it's really how are we going to address that big deficit and lack of education? Dr. Chris Davison is excellent at it. There's a lot of other assessors that can come in. There's a lot of private programs, non-public schools out there, but something needs to change if your child's going to be successful the next 4 years in high school. And I would definitely look at your assessments. What information do you need to get there?
Right. And I would think that an IEP team and a school district would have the knowledge to be able to develop an IEP for any student.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. What should be required at a transition IEP? Who should be there and what should they discuss?
I guess, you know, transition can mean a few different things. We see it thrown around a lot, like transitioning from elementary to middle school to high school. Are we just switching schools, teams? Is it a transition assessment and transition of plan? When a student turns 16, they're going to get a transition and look at post-secondary goals. But to answer all that, it's just whoever needs to be there, whoever has information on what program, where they're going. If there's two teams and you're handing it off and that's the transition, then both teams should be there. And a lot of times we'll have, say, for example, a 6th grade team, and then we'll have some representative for the junior high team, and we'll just talk and share. It's all about collaboration. There's nothing in the law that limits the district from doing anything. There's certain things that they don't have to do, but make the request, work together. So my quick answer would be whoever needs to be there, whoever has information, ask them to be there.
Yeah, and the most important thing is that you have the opportunity to meet the new, if you're transitioning from one school to another, from whether it be preschool to kinder and grade school to junior high to high school, you want to have your new IEP team, someone from the new school site at your meeting to be able to transition the IEP and have that person become familiar with your child's IEP, because they're receiving your child. You want them to be familiar, and you have the opportunity to say, this is what my child needs. These are some of the accommodations that are the most important for them, you know, and be able to meet some kind of representative from the new school site. And it's even nicer when a teacher can be there or a case carrier, but sometimes that's not possible. But yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, next question. Can the district add a PWN in all IEP minutes?
I don't know what that question means with the PWN. I know that what I get a lot of confusion that families have with the prior written notice. The IEP is the prior written notice. So you can go to an IEP meeting, make requests, and the district can respond at the meeting. That's their response. A written response, right? That's a written document responding to your request. When you make certain requests outside of the IEP meeting, the district needs to put it in writing, and that's the prior written notice. But if the district says no at the IEP meeting, that meeting is your prior written notice. You can request additional. They may officially respond after, but I wouldn't be so concerned of the format of the prior written notice versus what information did they use to base their decision to deny or grant your request.
So what about when you make a request at a meeting and the team doesn't make the decision and doesn't have a discussion, and
then that would, yeah, and if that falls under the prior written notice, like you request IEEs, which isn't necessary for the IEP team to determine, that's an admin decision, and they say we'll get back to you, that would be a prior written notice.
Yeah. Or you say you ask for a non-public school. Well,
right.
We'll respond to you with a prior written notice.
But they can respond at the IEP meeting and
yes.
put it in writing at the IEP, and that would be your prior written notice.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, we probably have time for one or two more questions.
Can I ask Rich a question, Casey?
Of course.
Because this is a question I know parents want to ask. Rich, what is your opinion, or what is the legal mandate for when we are looking at when we're looking at an assessment or an IE assessor recommends, say, services and or even goals, okay, and the team is saying, and that those recommendations are based off, of course, the low test scores, okay, so because of course assessments drive the recommendations for goals, accommodations, and services and placement. So the team is saying, no, we don't believe we need to write that goal, or we don't believe that the child needs that level of frequency and duration of services because their school achievement at school doesn't warrant that. They are doing this, and this. We don't see that at school. We don't see the need at school. So they're putting weight on how the child is performing in the school day and disagreeing with the standardized test scores.
Yeah, and I think okay. You're going to present your concerns and you're going to say why. Why are you requesting this? And if there's just a disagreement on how they're performing, or they're meeting their standards, their grades are well, one of the first things that we look at, show us. So give us
it's not necessarily meeting standards. Or it's not based. It's just based off the teacher saying, at the school site, we don't see that as a problem. The child is performing fine at school, so we don't need that goal. Or we don't.
And so right. And then that's just getting more data, right? And either, I really encourage families to go observe. I know with COVID restrictions, it's a little bit more difficult. We can get more observations from our outside assessors, really work with the district to understand if there's truly a disagreement on where they're performing. Are they functioning good, well at school, but then on the standardized testing, they're struggling. We want to know why. We've seen it in some students do really poorly attention-wise in SDC classes, but in a gen ed class, which you might think the reverse, they're attending to task way more. And that's based on observational data from our experts. Why? What's the difference of that makeup? We just need more information to get I always believe as an attorney, our job is to find solution to difficult problems. And that's the same as you with the advocacy. So to understand what the solution is, we have to identify the issue. And then usually once we do that, we can work with the team to develop a reasonable plan for that student. So the example that you gave, I'd want more information, and let's go in the classroom and figure it out.
Right. So basically, team's opinion of the child's school performance weighs in as much as standardized test scores?
Absolutely.
Okay.
How they're actually performing in a 3-hour standardized assessment versus a teacher who's with that child, whole school year, they're very valuable information. But how they perform here is different than how they're performing. There's so many wonderful teachers that just have great natural accommodations, and it's comfortable, and so it's really important to understand that.
Yes. So we just get more data. We take more data.
More data for sure.
Yes.
I think that's about all we have time for this evening. Randa, did you have anything you wanted to say before we close this evening?
Rich and Valerie, can we send you the questions to be answered, and then we could report it back? Is there any way we could do that?
Yeah, absolutely. If you could put it in something that's easy for us to respond to, not like if you just want to write them out like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we can put a quick response or something. I'd be more than happy to do that. I really want to make sure everybody's questions are answered. And I just want to say one last thing for those that are still here listening. Thank you for your time and to the district. I know this is the CAC. This is the collaboration in the law that's written in for the district families to come together. I can't say enough how hard districts work, the educators work. So for the educators that are here, thank you so much for what you do. There's always going to be problems. That's just how we work as humans, but there's always solutions to those problems, and it's really working together. So for the families, as frustrated as you are, there are solutions there, and there are people on the team that have those solutions and can help you resolve your issues.
And if the team doesn't, then they hire you guys, right? But I just wanted to also say thank you guys for joining us. We do have our CAC board meeting on Thursday from 6 to 8. It will be on Zoom. So for whoever's listening, we would love for you to join us. We will be having another parent training in January to continue our series for this school year. So we do really appreciate Rich and Valerie joining us today and presenting and answering many questions for us and the questions that remain too. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Randa, for having us.
Yes, thank you.
All right, have a good night, everyone.
And thanks, Casey, for helping us.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Thanks.
Have a good evening. Bye, everyone. Thanks again for joining us.
Bye, thank you.